I'm Charlie Wright with Gold Derby, and as part of our Behind the Lens Meet the Experts panels for documentary filmmakers, we're talking with Dan Cogan, the producer of the documentary Becoming Cousteau from National Geographic. First question I wanted to ask Dan was, what about Cousteau or his life made Liz Garbus, the director, want to explore everything about him?
Cousteau was this extraordinary figure. He was one of the best known men in the world in the 1970s and 80s. And then he completely dropped off the map. And, Liz and I are not only producer and director, but also we're married, and we were reading a book to our 7-year-old son. We had found this book, who is Jacques Cousteau? Who is Gandhi and who is Martin Luther King? And he had no idea. And reading that book to him, it made us realize that this was this extraordinary man who really opened up the world of the oceans for the entire globe in the 50s and 60s, and then had this extraordinary television hit in the 1970s that had millions of people falling in love with the oceans and with the animals in it. And his legacy was being forgotten. And it was really that desire to bring him back, particularly at this moment of the dangers and threats to the oceans through climate change, that inspired us to make the film.
Did you have a personal connection with the works of Jacques Cousteau before becoming involved with this documentary?
Yes, my personal connection was being, 7 years old and sitting on the floor in front of my television and being wowed when I was shown his world of sharks, or the story of the whales, or sea anemones, or, every Sunday night it was Wild Kingdom and Jacques Cousteau. And I, it inspired me to see differently and to want to understand the world that I was in and to understand the animals that were in it. And it was just shocking to me when I realized that that incredible legacy was disappearing. And that's what began a 6-year journey to make this film, to make contact with the Cousteau archives and to explore what could be done and to see if we could bring Cousteau back into the cultural conversation at this important moment.
What aspect of Jacques Cousteau's life were you most surprised to learn about from this documentary? Because I can only imagine, having, like you said, watching and being enamored by his work when you were so young. There must have been a lot of things in this process that surprised you. I was wondering what you found the most surprising.
So, as a child, I knew of him as someone who believed in conservation of the world's oceans and the creatures within it. But what we learned when we dug into the movie was, at first he began simply as an adventurer. He loved swimming underwater. He did it, actually, he began doing it to rehabilitate from a terrible car accident. And he just loved seeing this world that no one really had ever seen before. And he then became an inventor because he literally helped create. He was one of 2 people who created the aqualung, the first sort of scuba equipment, so that he could stay down longer. So he went from being an adventurer to being an inventor. And then it was only after a long time into his 50s and 60s that he realized this world that he had fallen in love with, that he had uncovered for the world, was under threat. And, one of the interesting things we learned about him was that in order to pay for his adventures and his explorations, he did a lot of oil prospecting. He found oil for a lot of countries in the Gulf on the Calypso. And it's something that we don't think of Jacques Cousteau as connected to. But this was before anyone knew about the impact of fossil fuels on climate change. It was before there was climate change that was recognized. We're talking in the 50s and into the 60s. And so it was fascinating to learn that this was a guy who fell in love with the world, then did some things that now we would look back as, not good for the long-term health of that world, and then changed. He changed, he evolved, and the things that he once did, he would never do again, and he fought against. And to me, that story of evolution is incredibly inspiring, because that's what we need right now. We just had COP26, and it so far has not been as successful, I think, as many activists had hoped. And what we need to know as human beings is that we can change. We don't have to be the same. We don't have to be reliant on fossil fuels. We don't have to have the same positions on energy that we've had for the last 100 years. We can all evolve. And I think Cousteau offers us an example of someone who evolved and then tried to make a difference.
One of the other striking things about that documentary, about what we see about Cousteau in this documentary, is, and correct me if I'm wrong, but it seemed like when you look at all the hyphenates of everything that he personally considered himself to be a filmmaker above everything else. And I was wondering if you could just speak to that a little bit.
Yeah, it's such a great question because it was something that we thought a lot about as storytellers. We wanted to make a feature-length film about Cousteau. We didn't want to make a series. And his life was so rich and extraordinary that we really had to focus on what is the aspect of his story that we're going to tell. There's a whole world of his work in the underground in World War II in France, fighting against the Nazis, that's incredibly rich. And there's his work at the end of his life that's rich. And we decided to focus on this arc, this evolution. But his life as a storyteller, purely as a filmmaker, is incredibly important. This is a guy who Louis Malle called one of the great directors of all time. Louis Malle, the great French director, he was an intern for Jacques Cousteau on Calypso, and grew into being his cameraman. And so he talks about Cousteau's unbelievable sense of cinema and story and editing. And he was, in his mind, he was first and foremost a filmmaker. He bought his first camera when he was 13. And he had been making movies ever since. And he built one of the first housings for a camera to shoot underwater. He spent an enormous amount of time building new lighting so that he could shoot underwater that was safe to shoot with underwater. So he was a filmmaker in his soul, but what he shot came from the part of him that was an adventurer, and the way he did it came from the part of him that was an inventor. And it's all these different hats that he wore that make him such an incredibly rich and inspiring figure.
Do you think that there is anyone that we currently have in our society, whether it be in entertainment or in science, or the overlap between the two, who occupies the same kind of pop culture level that Jacques Cousteau had in our society?
Charlie, it's such a great question. And the incredibly sad answer is no. This is a guy who at the first Earth Summit was in Rio in 1992. And Cousteau was one of the leaders of that summit. And at that event, he had time where he sat with President Bush. He had time where he sat with Fidel Castro. He had time where he sat with Russians. Like, he was incredibly respected by figures all over the world of all political persuasions. They do a photograph with the world leaders at the end, and he's the only person who is not a government official. They called him Captain Planet, and he was in the official photograph of Rio, and he spoke to and had influence on everyone of all political persuasions. And that, in our polarized world, that kind of figure, it sadly doesn't exist. And it's something that Liz and I thought a lot about, like, who is it today who is the new Jacques Cousteau? And really it doesn't exist. And it speaks to part of Cousteau's legacy, which is we have to try to build a sense of commonality around our goals to protect both human civilization and the oceans. And that's what Cousteau would be doing right now if he could.
Lastly, I did want to ask, we are an awards site, so you did win an Oscar in 2017 for Best Documentary Feature as the producer of Brian Fogel's documentary Icarus. I was wondering, what was that experience like for you when that happened?
You don't ever think it's actually going to happen. I mean, and that film was such a crazy, stressful ride in and of itself, protecting this whistleblower from the Russians who wanted to assassinate him and hiding him in America. And so it was, that period of my life seems in some way like such a blur of intensity and adrenaline. And that particular moment, it just felt very humbling because, that room is a room of people who, as a storyteller, you admire and look up to and see as role models. And to be recognized in that room was just an incredible honor and somewhat surreal.
One other question I meant to ask beforehand. Was there any attempt to have Cousteau's other son from his first wife, Jean-Michel, be a part of this documentary?
Yeah, we talked about that a lot. I mean, one of the sad things about the Cousteau legacy is that his family is at war. He had two wives, and his second wife has an enormous amount of conflict with the rest of the family. And there are many generations of Cousteaus, and they're all doing wonderful work, but they have not been able to find a way to work together. And it's just a sort of sad part of that legacy, but it's also one that doesn't speak to who Cousteau was and his impact on the world. It's sort of the private side. And we thought about, do we want to tell that story? And ultimately, it's not a story that's about his legacy. It's a story sort of about the private, legal squabblings of an estate. And, I've worked on many, many films with the estates of famous people, and it's always sadly like this. There's always fighting over who gets to control it and who gets the money and all of that. And it's very sad. And it was a sad part of his legacy. And I think in some ways it's prevented him from having the legacy with young generations that he has now. So our goal with the film was just, don't get into that. Let's focus on who Cousteau was as a figure. Let's revive him for young people all over the world, and let's him have influence as the conservationist that he was.
Well, Dan, thank you so much for joining us for this panel, and we look forward to having you for our group chat in just a little bit. Thanks so much.
Wonderful. Thank you, Charlie. Appreciate it.